Information about the visioning statement is going to come back in a later meeting with edits based on all of the comments that we've had so far and from the online survey that's ongoing and the input we get at AdventureFest. So can I get a thumbs up from people online that they can hear me talking here? All right, great. So tonight we're going to take a turn and talk about the economic opportunities analysis. It's analogous to the housing needs analysis, but focusing on, well, employment issues. So here we've got the calendar for the things that we're doing in this year. Here in August, obviously we've got SAC meeting number 4. After this meeting, we're going to go back and take input from the group and come back in early November with a draft of the economic opportunities analysis. And then we'll be taking that to a decision maker meeting in early December. And then proceeding on to there and getting more into the 50-year plan as we're talking next year into some of the technical analysis for that. So tonight we're going to give you an overview of the EOA, the Economic Opportunities Analysis. We're going to talk about the buildable lands inventory. We're going to talk about some preliminary employment forecasts. And then Brittany's going to lead us in a discussion of competitive and comparative advantages. At the next meeting in November, we'll talk about whether the city has enough land to accommodate expected employment growth. And I'll tell you part of what the answer is probably not for commercial and probably does for industrial. And we'll talk about some more of those issues next time. The assessment of site needs. So tonight we're going to be talking about potential growth industries and the kind of lands that those growth industries need are what we'll be talking about in site needs. And we'll also be taking questions about the draft of the economic opportunities analysis document next time. Before I go on, are there any questions? Okay. So cities do an economic opportunities analysis in large part as part of their long-term growth planning. So in this project, we're looking at the next 20 years, and the next 20 years is what we're talking about tonight, as well as the next 50 years. It meets their legal requirements for comprehensive plan work, and we're updating the comprehensive plan policies as well as factual basis through this project. So that's part of Goal 9, which is the state's goal around economy. And then I think more interesting, this will provide information about existing conditions and forecast of future conditions to inform land use policy, certainly. If the city is doing at some point an economic development strategy or as we update the comprehensive plan policies, this information will all inform that, as well as coordination. And anybody who's been working on economic development knows that coordination is really, I think, the core of economic development. So this provides information to support that. So Goal 9, broadly speaking, requires that cities provide adequate opportunities throughout the state for a variety of economic activities vital to the health, welfare, and prosperity of Oregon's citizens. So this is a really broad goal. It invites us to look at a variety of different activities, and it gives us a fair bit of room to talk about different types of economic activities, which we will be doing through this discussion tonight. So looking at our work program, we've got the buildable lands inventory, which we'll present to you tonight. Information about economic trends and the employment forecast and economic development growth potential, which is really what we'll talk about tonight around the comparative and competitive advantages in Scappoose. Recommendations for changes to economic development policies and goals in the comprehensive plan. Those will come a little bit later. And in the end, we've got your final products from this, which will be the EOA, and we'll be including in it, although we're not showing you right now, we'll be including in it a 50-year forecast for the establishment of urban reserves later on in the project. So the product projects, I just went over that, so I won't go into that. So we're going to talk buildable lands inventories. So this is similar to the buildable lands inventory for the housing needs analysis. We do things a little bit different than MIG and Johnson, but it's at its heart very similar. So we start with gathering data about Scappoose, and that data is things like tax lot information, building and improvement values, physical constraints such as wetlands or floodplains, zoning and comprehensive plan designations. All of these kind of things go into this. We classify land into some mutually exclusive categories, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. We identify and remove constraints from your vacant or partially vacant land, so your land that could accommodate development, so that we are in the end looking at vacant and partially vacant commercial and industrial land where employment could go. We do a few rounds of verification, which we've done with the city, and part of this meeting and any future input that you want to have, you're part of that verification. And in the end, we summarize the results into the EOA document. So what we're showing you here is two different maps of Scappoose. On the left-hand side, we've got your zoning ordinance, your zoning designations. And part of the reason that we're looking at this by zone is that around your airport, you've got these different overlay zones that are really important for the types of employment that are allowed there. So where zoning is difficult and not as useful is in areas that are outside of the city limits, but inside of the urban growth boundary and are in county zoning. So that's things like rural residential 5. Well, what's residential doing in here? Well, it's zoned that, but when it's brought into the city limits, it's going to be rezoned to a county zone. And it's, sorry? Yes, rezoned to a city zone. I know I said county, but I meant city. And its plan designation, you can see on the map on the right-hand side, is commercial. So in some cases, some of the things that are still in the county, their zoning is what they were before they were brought into the UGB, and develop with that. They're going to develop in the future with either industrial or commercial zones, or in some cases, the airport employment zone. So does that basically make sense here? You have questions about that? Because otherwise I'm going to confuse you a lot in a few minutes. We're also showing on this map, you'll see a few parcels that are outlined in green. Those are port-owned parcels. We're noting those because we need to do a little bit more research about how the port is planning on developing those. So those are, I think, parcels that could be leased, but cannot be sold by the port. So you could get some economic activity on them, but they're going to have different opportunities, different potential than land that can be privately owned. Any questions before I go on? Yes, ma'am. Kim.
So just to be clear, the left side is current state, the right side is future state.
Yeah, sure. We could go with that. The left side zoning is what's currently being planned for. The other side is what's expected to happen over the 20-year period. In most of the cases for land inside the city limits, I won't say all because I might have missed a little something, the zoning and the comprehensive plan are in harmony with each other. In the case of some county land, there's what we call zone plan conflicts, and it'll be resolved when the land is brought into the city limits. Did I get all of that right? Okay. Chair Kessie?
Does anyone online have a question?
Paul?
Yeah, I don't know if it's material. I think technically the port property can be sold. It's just unlikely to be sold. The port has sold some property, but whether or not that factors into your determinations in the big picture, it actually could be sold.
We'll verify that with the port and just make sure that we're reporting on those pieces of land correctly. Thank you. Any other questions before I go on to some of the more interesting parts of the inventory? All right, so this is all of the land that you see. We'll talk about the comprehensive plan map just to make it easier. All of that is land that's expected to be developed with some sort of industrial or commercial use over the next 20 years, or is already developed with those uses. So all of that is in your inventory of your commercial and industrial land. Otherwise, you're not seeing, say, land that's within the city limits that is zoned for housing. You're not seeing that in this inventory because it's not part of this inventory. So then we classify all the land that's planned for commercial and industrial uses into a few different categories. We've got your developed land, and that's lots that are fully developed currently and are unlikely to redevelop over the next 20 years. We say unlikely because sometimes redevelopment happens where you least expect it. So redevelopment could occur on some of this land, but we're not looking at a lot of that land for that. I'm going to skip to the public land category then. So that's land that's publicly owned, that's considered unavailable for commercial or industrial development. And that includes land that's in federal, state, county, and city ownership, or it could also be owned by the school district or other public entities. So where we're looking at this in a little more detail, say our port-owned lands that are publicly owned that are potentially available for development over the next 20 years. So we're considering that some publicly owned land is available for development. Undevelopable land is just little tiny pieces of lots that are just so tiny that we're just sweeping them out of the inventory and considering them undevelopable so that we've got a little easier time with the inventory. That's really a housekeeping measure. So your vacant lots are lots that are equal to or larger than 1/2 acre, bless you, equal to or larger than 1/2 acre that doesn't currently contain permanent buildings or improvements, or equal to or larger than 5 acres where less than 1/2 acre is occupied by a permanent building or improvement. So generally speaking, these are lots where you don't have much development to speak of. And so these are lots that are either larger and have a little bit of development, or sort of mid-size and don't really have any development on them. Your partially vacant lots are those between 1 acre and 5 acres that have a use, but there's still land that could be further developed based on zoning. And we identified those by looking at each of these lot by lot and making sure that we agreed with the assessment. So partially vacant was identified on a lot by lot basis. And sometimes you'll have a lot that is that's say 2 acres that has a little bit of it developed and more of it that's not developed, where you really reasonably could have more commercial or industrial activity. Are there any questions about that before I go on?
Brian Rosenthal? That's good.
Brian, yes, please. I'm not sure your microphone's turned on. Okay.
Question, so if I understand you correctly, less than 1/2 acre is not going into inventory?
Yes.
Okay, I mean, I guess that's okay, but I've built 2 buildings in town on less than 1/2 acre. Commercial.
We could be looking at smaller lots. So we could, you could say this is a conservative inventory, that there's a little more capacity than what we're talking about.
Okay, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. I was just making sure I understood it. Thank you.
Yeah, and let me make it clear that anything that we're doing in here, like Brian, if you owned a 1/2 acre lot and you wanted to develop something more on it, or you wanted to develop anything on it, even though it's not in the inventory, that doesn't affect your ability to develop it. This inventory is for the sake of doing the EOA. It doesn't have force of law behind it.
Thank you.
Be beneficial to those clients.
We could include smaller parcels. We'd want to set a lower parcel limit. It's not going to gain all that much. It's not going to change things all that much. So, and we'll talk in a little bit as we look at the end of this about what you may be seeing in terms of unmet needs. Jeff, did you have a comment?
Telling Christine to speak into the microphone.
Yeah, I understand.
Kim, do you have a comment?
No, I believe there's a comment back in the audience.
Is this on? Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that you've already eliminated the wetlands and the floodplains and stuff like
That's
that.
next.
Oh, that's
It's coming up.
undeveloped. I know. Eager.
I know. All right, so development constraints. So we've included the 100-year floodplain, wetlands that are locally significant or have been delineated, meaning that the specific areas of the wetlands have been identified more than your local wetland inventory has. Perennial stream buffers, slopes over 15%, areas with landslide high susceptibility, and your runway protection zone. Those are areas that we're all considering as prohibitions to development. So they're all constraints where we wouldn't be allowing development, or we wouldn't be expecting development. You can see most of your steep slopes and your landside areas are in residential areas. They don't really affect your commercial industrial much. And in one case where you've got a delineated wetland here, we actually worked with the actual delineation to add it to your inventory because it wasn't in the official. It's been officially adopted, but it wasn't in the inventory.
So the blue is floodplain.
Blue is floodplain. You guys have a lot of floodplain.
Lori, is this the new floodplain or the one that we're disputing, or?
We can only use what's currently in effect at this time. So this reflects the current floodplain at this time. And that's all we can use. It's a snapshot in time. What we did make sure is for specifically the East Airport properties and the ones south of the runway, and this is what Beth was mentioning, we pulled in the actual wetland delineation that was done for that property. So that is reflected in the purple there. And that is generally speaking where we would expect future floodplain to be on those parcels. So in that way, it is taking it out of the inventory so that we're not considering that acreage as developable.
Any other questions before going?
Yes, I would ask, when is there a date for kind of resolution on the new delineations would be made, or?
Do you mean for floodplain?
Mhm.
The city applied for a grant to have some additional analysis done in relation to that. And so we should be getting that award letter any day now, which would kick off that additional work. Once that work is completed, which could take six weeks-ish, 6 to 8 probably, we would then look at the maps again, see kind of how it looks, get some consensus with city and county staff on if we feel like that as actually reflecting the real true 1% annual chance risk. Once the city and county has signed off on that application to FEMA, once it's submitted to them, it could be, I don't know what their review times are right now. It was quite bad during COVID, but maybe 6 to 9 months before they review it and sign off on it. So we could be a year out before it's in effect.
Any other questions? Okay, so what this is showing you is the status of land, and then the gray hatches on top of things are the constraints. So what you see is in red, vacant land, in green, your public land, and that's including your airport, runway, that kind of thing. In, I think we'll call it yellow, your partially vacant land. So those are, and then in gray, your developed land. So those are your development statuses. And then when we look at this, we've looked at this by zone, but remember that as we're seeing land that's zoned RR5, we're going to consider that that particular land, most of it is commercial, some of it is at the airport. So we'll be considering what the plan designation is on that. So what you see here is land that is vacant and unconstrained. and potentially developable. And here we've got it by plan designation also, so that we've got consistency for the county-owned land. What's really important from an economic development perspective, as we're going forward and doing the next step of this, is making sure that we've got all of the airport designated land in sort of their own categories, because there's a lot of different uses that are allowed, say, at the airport business park rather than the airport industrial park. And I forget what the EAE is, employment
East
Yeah.
Airport
employment
Employment.
area. Okay, there we go. So we'll be thinking about that in our next step as we're looking at land sufficiency.
Brian Rosenthal. Question. So the airport business park is more or less kind of like a commercial overlay. And so there's a few things that are excluded, but for the most part, it's commercial land for practical purposes. The purpose of the EOA, are we considering it industrial land, or are we considering it commercial land, or both, or split, or what are we doing?
You know, I need to look at the uses allowed there in a little more detail. I would be, I'm not sure I'm ready to make an answer to that.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the reason though for showing the overlays, because there are different uses permitted. Mhm.
I was just
Mhm.
trying to figure out which column it's in. Thank you.
All right, any other questions here? So then the next slide shows our number of buildable acres, and we're going to be, this will have more nuance to it. But in the end, there's 412 buildable acres in airport employment comprehensive plan designation. Over on the green side, you can see 37 acres are at the airport business park, 49 at the industrial park, and 253 at the East Airport employment area. So that's what the airport employment zone is. Predominantly those overlays, and then of course some of that land is not in one of those overlays. Commercial, you've got 39 acres, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Well, I'll talk about that now. We've assumed that 60% of commercial land, or about 23 acres, is assumed available for commercial uses, with the remaining 40% assumed for purely residential uses. And so that's consistent with the analysis in the EOA. It's consistent with the assumptions there. And essentially that 60% of commercial land, it could be mixed use development. So it could be commercial on the bottom and then housing on top. But we're assuming that 60% of commercial land, so 23 acres, definitely has some commercial uses on it. We're assuming that other 40% only has residential uses on it. And then you've got 30 acres that's just plain zoned industrial. So we'll end up taking, yeah, that's Brian, that's a really interesting question. We'll have to think about the airport business
Yeah.
park.
I was thinking about it, and it's pulling off these numbers,
Mhm.
but there is a substantial amount of acreage in Airport Business Park, and so it would blow all these numbers out of the water. My memory of it is the few exclusions, there's no housing, so it's purely commercial, and you can't put a big box store there. Almost everything else is okay. They limit retail by square footage, and I think it might be 10,000 square feet, but it's not massive. But other than that, you can put office buildings, you can put restaurants, you can put hotels, pretty much everything. So I would not feel comfortable moving past this point until we resolve that issue, because we have to go off numbers that are solid, I think, and I don't feel like we have solid numbers till we get that resolved.
Yeah, I expect that'll be something we'll be talking about in the November meeting. So, okay. And I think that ends up being the end of the buildable lands inventory. Are there questions about that? Are there concerns?
Len,
I think we might have lost audio again. Have you guys been saying anything?
Yeah, I agree.
So the question is so far about the commercial land, and the last big commercial property, I think, is the one that you're talking about, that is in the south off to the west.
Right, just the turnoff next to where the food carts are gonna go. It wraps up behind that. It's like 12.5 acres.
And you were talking about the fact that the city uses commercial land as A1 land
Right,
for residential. Mhm.
right. And we saw that happen over on First Street.
Mhm.
And there's not much real pure commercial, and there's
Yeah.
no way to protect the amount of commercial. So when you look at defining commercial land, when you're really defining something that is volatile to housing, you're not having commercial land. So we need to figure out, we put it into C, take it out of AC, or eliminate the A1 capacity in EC. We have to do one or the other.
So your comment is that we need to make sure that the city has land that's available for, I'll call it traditional commercial, so that we can distinguish a little bit from the commercial that we'd be talking about in the airport area. And I would say that that is one, I don't disagree that there's some issues. And I would say that those questions should come up, that they should be discussed more about 2 or 3 meetings from now. In other words, we'll have some more answers about all land need in about 2 different meetings from now, so in January. And then I think we should be having some of those policy discussions about what do we do with rezoning once we have all the information on the table.
Okay, well, it's a critical issue here because
Yeah.
one of these days Walmart's going to come and say there's no place to go at all.
Certainly, it is a critical issue. And we'll also have the housing needs analysis finished at that point. So we can talk about everything as a whole and have some discussions about whether the different character of some of the different commercial lands. So, yeah. And so I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Laurie, but I think some of the outcomes of this project might well be recommendations for rezoning or
That's
changing
correct.
zonings.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Absolutely. It's definitely an issue.
Any other comments or questions?
Are there any questions online from the online people, NJ? Okay. And we had a comment about including less than a half acre sites in the commercial inventory. Do we want to recommend her to do that, or what would be our next step there, Beth?
Well, I wouldn't really recommend that you go much below, say, 10,000 square feet. So we could look at how much land is between 10,000 square feet and half an acre. And that's going to be a small amount of land. And if you'd like us to, we could include that in the inventory, subtracting out constraints where you want. And I would expect that to move. First of all, I would only do that for commercial land. I wouldn't do it for industrial land, in all honesty, because industrial land just doesn't function quite the same way. And I would expect that if I was a betting woman, I'm betting that we'd get up in the low 40s from 39 acres. So it's going to make a couple of acres difference.
The other,
think.
yeah, and then the other thing too is it just reduces the amount of land that we may show a need for.
Yes. So if the city is looking at a UGB expansion, which I think the city will be for different needs, and I'm not sure what buckets those lands will be in, but commercial is one of the places we need to take a close look. Then if you include more of the smaller parcels, then that decreases your need for a UGB expansion. You're not, I mean, the assumptions that we used about what's vacant, those are right out of Goal 9. They're right out of the administrative rules. We've quoted literally what the administrative rules say for that. You can assume that, smaller parcels are vacant if you chose to, but you're under no obligation to do so. And it's going to be a very small amount of land, I expect.
Len, do you have a question?
Yeah, one thing, when you've got small parcels, I think you have to consider that you have a building that might have 10 storefronts and each storefront owns 2,500 feet or like a condominium. Okay, and this is not uncommon in commercial real estate. Downtown Portland's full of it. Every city in the country is full of it. And it's, you know, it's a practical way for a developer to look and say, okay, I'm going to build this fascia and I'm going to separate these deals and I can sell, you know, a 2,500 foot or a 5,000 or whatever. So that's where the small lot definition comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. It just it doesn't prevent anyone from doing that. It's just a matter of do we include it in the inventory or not? Because if we include it, then we're reducing our actual need for the land. So that's the trade-off.
You need a 10,000, 20,000 foot property to do that with. Yeah.
Right.
Any other questions?
So
Okay, go ahead.
when we're a little further along, I'm going to make a note to come back to the small lots and see if anybody wants to make a specific recommendation to look at small lots more closely. But I'd like to finish talking about the other part of this, which is the forecast for growth. That's okay.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. Hopefully I'll remember to do that. All right. So then looking at the preliminary forecast. So I mentioned to you that we've looked at state and national trends. And this is about 20 pages of information that you'll have in the EOA. So lots and lots of information. Just talking about a few of them. So you might have heard that we have a tight labor market and increasing labor costs. Employment has recently gotten to about the same as pre-pandemic levels, at least across the state. And as of April 2022, wages had increased about 5% year over year. You might have also heard that we've got the highest inflation rates in 40 years. And remember that this is a 20-year plan, so we're not expecting these high inflation rates to last 20 years. Could be wrong, but it will hopefully will not. We've got rising housing costs. So housing costs have been rising faster than incomes for a long time, especially for ownership, but also for rental housing. You've got an aging population that's driving need for replacement workers. So that's, you know, part of the tight labor market. And you've got some interesting things going on with work from home trends. I've been reading some things saying, oh, everybody's going to continue working from home forever. And then I've been reading some things that are saying in small to mid-sized cities that no, people are coming back to the office more. And I don't think I feel like making a good guess other than work from home isn't necessarily going to go away. I don't think there'll be no demand for commercial office right now. Demand for commercial office in a lot of markets is pretty soft, but what's it going to look like in 3 to 5 years? So I think that is a trend that's important, but it's not of the overwhelming importance, overwhelming anything else. And we've got continued transformation of the retail sector with growth in e-commerce. So you'll see in a few minutes as we talk about the forecast, when we're looking at retail, we're really thinking about how might retail change in Scappoose and in all of our communities because of e-commerce. So part of my answer to this is that things that you need to do in person are going to remain with retail. You'll still have some small boutique-y sort of shops. I think so. That's my prediction. Well, all right, Scappoose has to get them first. But things like restaurants and those kind of things that aren't considered retail in this. But those kind of experiential sort of things will continue to be in communities. You see your increases in automation. We've got a picture here from the OMEC, which is in a lot of ways driving some of those interesting increases in automation. What you see is your low and middle wage jobs are at higher risk of automation. So in 20 years, in 5 years, will you be ordering at McDonald's from a robot? You can already do that at some McDonald's. You're not seeing that risk so much at your higher wage jobs. So, and it's less of a risk for your middle wage jobs. But when looking at some of the long-term projections at the federal level, there's a lot of risk for your jobs that have wages less than $20 an hour. Rising energy prices, we've all noticed that. Any of the forecasts I've seen are not showing long-term decreases in energy prices, and I don't think they will until our economy shifts a little bit the types of energy we're using. Potential impacts of climate change here in Scappoose, where you have so much wetness, so much floodplain, that kind of thing. You're at more risk as a result of unusual flooding. So how often is our 100-year flood going to be? And I'm not an expert in those areas or in floodplains or wetlands or anything like that, but certainly those pose risks for all our cities. And increased racial and ethnic diversity, I think, is an interesting opportunity. So how in Oregon do we engage with our increasing diversity to make it more of a strength? I think that's an interesting question that we can think about through this project. So these are some of the biggest trends we're seeing. There's some other trends that are interesting and are certainly included in the EOA. I don't think we talked about unemployment for instance here. So that kind of trends are included. Commuting trends are some pretty interesting trends in Scappoose. So 19% of jobs in Scappoose, I like how we put this, 19% of jobs in Scappoose are held by people who live and work in Scappoose. And you might say only 19%, that's terrible. And from a certain perspective, you're not wrong. This is really common, especially for our smaller cities. You see a lot of in-commuting. So we've got 1,392 people who live somewhere other than the city of Scappoose that commute in for jobs. And you've got 3,469 people who live in Scappoose and work somewhere else. That could be in unincorporated Columbia County, it could be in St. Helens, it could be in Portland, Hillsborough, all kinds of areas around the region. And so commuting is common in Scappoose as it is in all of our communities. And I'm going to put you guys for a moment in the Portland region because they're just not that far. And most of the cities in Portland, aside from the city of Portland, not much more than 20% of the people who live in the city also work in the city. You're close enough that commuting is pretty common.
Beth, what is a best practice for that?
Well, that's an interesting question. So you want to, I think, I'm going to guess that what you want to do is see more people live and work in your community. So in part, you guys are in a location that, going up the Columbia up towards St. Helens, certainly somebody who say their spouse works in St. Helens and they work down in Portland, Scappoose is a nice place to be. You're not necessarily going to change that pattern for some people. Some people are just going to prefer to drive to where they work and live where they love, which I think Scappoose, for a number of reasons, is that kind of place. So your macroeconomic trends are going to change that. So if gas prices go high enough and we don't have alternatives to driving gasoline cars, then people will be less willing and able to commute. What are your best practices to have that happen less? It's about having enough housing in Scappoose that people who work here can also afford to live here. And then it's about having enough jobs in Scappoose for people who live here to have a job working here, and a variety of jobs. So your service jobs that may pay a little bit less, your manufacturing jobs that may pay more, and sort of everything in between, as well as having the services that people need to be in Scappoose. So services like medical services, personal finance, your restaurants, your cute boutiques, all of that kind of thing. So these are all kinds of things to think about for growth over the next 20 years. Did that start to answer your question?
I guess I was more asking what's the healthy mix, right? I mean, we look at other cities and, okay, we're okay at 19% because other cities are that way, but what is a good goal?
I don't necessarily think that choosing a goal for commuting is going to be all that productive. When we were looking at this very issue for the city of Corvallis a number of years ago, we looked at a whole bunch of other cities similar to Corvallis in size where they had a university. And the only city where we saw significantly different commuting patterns was in Flagstaff, where I think 65% of people lived and worked in Flagstaff. And if you've been in Flagstaff, you know that's because nothing's around Flagstaff. And so by dint of being so isolated, they had a lot of people who live and work in the community. For better or worse, and I think it's mostly for better probably, you're part of this larger region where it's easy to commute in. And so other than making sure you've got jobs and housing that's affordable, there's not a lot that the city can do. And I'm not sure that there's a lot that the city should do to try to stop commuting. Because part of what you're gaining with commuting, other than pollution and that kind of thing, is you're gaining access to a wider base of employees. So you've got, you know, your company that needs people who know how to make widgets. Well, if you could only have people who lived in Scappoose that make widgets, then that's a really small employment base. But since you can pull from places like Portland and Hillsborough and other places, that's an advantage to the company. I don't know, Brittany, you might have a different opinion because you've been doing economic development differently than I have.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think it is smart to
A little closer.
think about the larger region and that that larger talent pool, and talent doesn't see jurisdictional boundaries like we all do. I think in this room, I think it's common to move around work and home. And I didn't know the averages across the regions. I think that's interesting to think about Scappoose in comparison to others throughout the Portland metro region.
Len, did you have a question?
Yeah. Your chart, it looks like 3,500 people basically are leaving Scappoose daily to work someplace else.
Yep.
30, okay. That represents what's the percentage of that? That's 65%, 55% of the households or 55% of the population. What happens, keep in mind that they go to another market. Okay.
Mhm.
They buy from another market. They shop at another market. Leakage is a major thing in retail and in commercial processes. Okay.
Mhm.
And so we need more people obviously staying here, working here, shopping here. I mean, the buy local campaign is a great idea, but the reality of it is people are leaving this and they can go to, Hillsborough, they can go to Beaverton, they can go to Gresham, whatever else. So that commute process is not advantageous, I don't think, to this community. I think we're losing a lot.
And so you're right. You do have leakage through people working in other communities and commuting to other places. But what's the city's choices? What can the city do about that? Well, part of that is having more jobs here in Scappoose, which I would posit that you guys are well set up to have happen over the next 20 years. And we'll look at some forecasts in a few minutes. And also having more housing opportunities that people who live here can afford. So I'll give you an example in another community. I was working, we'll just call it in a community on the west side of the Portland area, where it cost about $100,000 a year to live there. And that wasn't even for buying a nice house. And average wages at jobs there were about $35,000. Well, you can see, even if you had a two-wage household, that household could not afford to live in that community. And part of the reason is that they just didn't have the right balance of housing types in that community. And frankly, they didn't have the right jobs. They were really focused on jobs related to retail and tourism and that kind of thing. And those are lower paying jobs. So you have to look at both that balance with enough housing development as well as a balance of different job types. So I won't disagree with you that leakage is a problem, but the city's opportunities to influence some of that beyond what I've just talked about are a little bit limited. You can't say, well, you guys can't live here if you're not going to work here. But you can do things to support housing growth and to support economic development. And I think the city is well poised for that.
I think Brian was next. You next? Okay, Christine.
So my question is probably naive. How does the city necessarily influence housing? Like we have these new apartments that are coming in right by the railroad tracks. You wouldn't think that would be prime real estate, but they're renting for an exorbitant amount. That's the market. But how does the city make housing?
So I don't want to step in the middle of your housing needs analysis, but there are different policies that the city can have to support development of housing that's affordable to your low and your mid-income households. And are you guys going to be talking about some of those policies in upcoming meetings?
Yeah, actually, August 30th, so the end of this month, our other consultant team, MIG and APG, will come back to talk about some of those options.
Although the flip side to that, from an economic opportunities discussion, is how do you bring in employers? How does the city encourage industry to come in and offer higher paying living wage jobs?
Well, to a certain degree, you do what you guys have already done. You attract something like OMIC with an education provider, and they have like 3 education providers. So you figure out how to attract manufacturing and other types of industries, which your OMIC is really set up to be that engine that does that. You have educational opportunities, which you do at PCC, and the connections with the other universities. So you're getting a workforce who is trained. Some of the workforce who's trained is going to stay in Scappoose. I think that some industries are going to be attracted to locating next to OMIC because there are advantages to it, and some of the advantages are availability of workforce, as well as opportunities for partnerships. So you do some of the things that the city is already in the process of, and that are real opportunities that most other communities don't have.
I agree with what you're saying, but I don't know that our city necessarily, like it's not marketing necessarily. Like Lori can't market to businesses. It's not way beyond what she has capacity to do. So I don't know that.
You're talking about recruitment, that kind of thing.
I mean, you said making it attractive, seeking other businesses. So how does the city ensure that other than having an economic development partner?
And so part of this starts to get into an economic development strategy, which we're not doing as part of this project, and the city could engage in at a later time. So I don't want to get too far down the hole of what is it the city could do to support economic development that the city is not already doing, because there ends up being a lot of policy discussions at that point.
So is that something that you've done in other
communities? Yeah, and it's going to.
I asked Lori why that was not included in this study, since it is something that's so crucial to our small community.
Yeah, because the EOA, so as far as why wasn't it included in the scope of this large project? We needed the studies that are required in order to look at our urban reserves. And that was going to be our economic opportunities analysis and our housing needs analysis, to look at those land needs. So this was just a component that's very more specific that did not include into the larger project. That doesn't mean that we can't include it at some point. We did actually talk about this and got a quote to do that work, and it does not fit within this budget for this project. So once this is wrapped up as a secondary follow-up project, the city could then decide if they wanted to move forward and spend money to do that component, which might be a better opportunity once everything kind of from this process has been completed and we sort of know what the plan is or how we intend to move forward. And so that's absolutely something that we could look at.
Seems that this approach would be very proactive
Mhm.
to building a city that we all want to live in. So I would hope that that
Yeah.
would be included.
And there's a lot of, just like you're saying, some of the outcomes of an economic development strategy would, of course, entail having staff to carry those things out. And so,
You know my quest for finding a hotel. So
Yep.
in just my effort to do that as an individual,
Yep.
I mean, it was quite an ordeal. So it would be nice to have a city that had that same mindset. to
Right.
build it, as Beth was just.
Well, I think it's important too to think about in the meantime that even without an economic development strategy, there's still a lot of work and momentum happening. So I was with Greater Portland Inc. prior to coming to ECHO, and that's the regional economic development agency working to recruit businesses, new businesses to the region. I'm looking at Paul Vogel on the screen and his economic development team. We talk a lot about how economic development is a team sport. It's not just up to the city or just up to the workforce board or just up to the universities. It's all of those things working in coordination and tandem, and that's what the strategy helps to do. So that's being done at the regional level, at the state level. As far as it comes down to the jurisdiction level, there's likely tangible work and recommendations that we could make, but it relies on data and some of the work that we're doing here. So this is really setting up a really strong foundation. There are going to be next steps and recommendations that come out of this work that are going to keep this work moving. But I just want you to feel confident that there is work happening at the regional level.
I absolutely know that and agree. I was just.
Yeah. Well, it's great that there's interest in it, and I think there's a ton of opportunity with it.
Boutiques, Beth.
I understand completely. I like the boutiques. And so Christine, I wouldn't want to imply that there will be no recommendations. It's just there won't be enough recommendations for what you want. Yes, and certainly. And I think there were some questions here.
Paul Fidrich, citizen. I don't want to sound too Star Trek, but it is a 50-year plan, 20-year we're looking at now. 15 years ago, this didn't exist, which is an iPhone or a smartphone. Self-driving cars are right around the corner, and I would like your opinion. You're the expert on how this is going to affect commuting patterns. I've read studies that since you can sleep in your car, people will be more apt to actually commute because they could sleep or do whatever, play games. I think that will drastically affect. I mean, this is right around the corner. Tesla's the #1 selling automobile in California this past month. How do you think it's going to affect Scappoose as a bedroom community?
Well, first of all, the project does have the possibility of bringing in, who is it at the University of Oregon? Urbanism Next at the University of Oregon. And they're really the futurists who are really looking at this. And from what I've heard, self-driving cars are not around the corner in terms of being in everybody's grasp in the next certainly 5 years. By the end of the 20-year period, that's entirely possible. By somewhere in the 50-year period, I fully expect. And so I don't really want to necessarily try to guess all these different assumptions you'd have to make. I mean, I would have to imagine that if self-driving cars were a reality, then how much commuting would Scappoose have? I think it would depend on whether you have housing that's affordable and whether you have jobs that are attractive to people who want to live here. And so I mean, that's a really poor answer to your question, but I do think it's going to fundamentally transform how we do transportation. I think it's just going to take a long time to filter in fully.
So what I've read is that people will actually picking where they live as the most important part, and where they.
That's consistent with what people do now. They pick where they live as the most important part.
Where they work will be now could be dramatically different. It could be a much longer range. The second part of my question is, general purpose AI robots are right around the corner as well. So I mean, just as the cotton gin pretty much got rid of picking cotton. And you'd said here that lower paying jobs are going away, yet a large part of our land use is around industrial, which are going to become more and more mechanized. So
But you're not going to have no jobs around industrial. There'll be different types of jobs around industrial.
understood. But, you know, as you can see in Amazon warehouses, they're continuously trying to replace labor with machinery.
Mhm.
The question is, since we have so much land there, should we be looking at using that land, again, this is a 50-year plan, in other ways, whether it be more commercial space, we know we lack a charming town at times. We know that we can't, you're not going to commute 40 miles to go eat. You're not going to, so there are other things this town needs. Is this an opportunity to look at that industrial land, which, as you just said up there, these lower paying jobs are going away, and look at the use of commercial and maybe even residential there?
And so I would say that the biggest asset that the city has at this point for economic growth, and whether that includes a lot of jobs or not, is that industrial land. I think if you give away that industrial land, you're giving away Scappoose opportunities for economic growth. Now, what's the value of land where you don't have a lot of jobs, but you have a lot of equipment? Well, that's value is in part in property taxes. So I'll use data warehouses as an example. I know that there are data warehouses in Central Oregon, for instance, that are very, very large and that have maybe 35 employees. So very low employment, but it also results in quite a lot of property tax revenue. And so how can the city choose to use the property tax revenue a little bit differently? So I don't want to discount industrial employment just based on the fact that there's going to be different types of jobs there in the future, and that there, is different value. Your industrial employment here is also connected with workforce training, which is, I don't want to call it unique, but it's nearly unique across the, within the state. This is in talking to Brittany about this and looking at what's going on across the region in terms of economic growth. I think we've both agreed that this is a really unusual opportunity that a town like Scappoose rarely has. So should there be any changes in zoning? Sure, maybe. But we haven't gotten to that part of the project. And so we need to have some more discussion before we get to that part. Does Scappoose lack a downtown and a center of community? Certainly. It's not that I don't like Scappoose. I love Scappoose. And I'm not being at all sarcastic with that. Do you need more services? I think you totally do. And partially they're going to come with some of the growth around the OMIC and attraction of other businesses and your agglomerative economies and so on and so forth. So some of that's going to come because you've got that other growth engine happening. And then some of it, getting a downtown that is a central place, that's going to be very difficult. That is not part of this project. I don't want to overpromise here, but that's going to require a fair bit of planning, and there are a number of other cities who've tackled that sort of problem. And I hope to bring in some voices from those cities to give the city some advice. Now, I think that there was a question here before we go back. And we have in our discussion of what do you call it? In our discussion of trends, that work from home is becoming more common, and I don't think it's going to go away. I think what you're describing as a hybrid model is going to be here to stay.
And I just raised that because of the point you raised about leakage, right? If people are leaving to go downtown, they're having lunch somewhere else, or maybe bringing dinner from somewhere else. But if you're only doing that 50% of the time, how does that then
Sure.
to the economic potential of the area? So if there's a way to factor that into,
I think we can talk about it qualitatively. Are there any other questions or comments? Here.
George Hafman. The world is going more to an online And a lot of the products that you purchase are online, and that's happening more and more. So my thought is adding more commercial buildings and things, some will happen, but I think most of the future is going to be online distribution centers rather than these small mom and pop places, although they'll always be there and always be handy. So I guess the comment is that to visualize Scappoose as having Nordstrom's and stuff like this, I doubt that's going to happen. And my sight for the future is that more and more is going to happen online. And so that, I don't know what will happen to retail, but when you can order something and a day later it's at your home and you don't have to go to Portland or Beaverton, I think we have to look for that world because that's going to happen.
And I think we are accounting for that, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes, if that's okay. Okay.
Beth, why don't we go forward?
We will go forward here. So then we're stepping into the employment forecast. So this is how much employment are we going to see in Scappoose over the next 20 years. We will be lengthening this out to a 50-year forecast a little bit later. We start from a base of employment, about how much employment do we think we have in Scappoose right now? How fast do we think employment's going to grow over the next 20 years? What's our future mix of employment? And then what do we think about future employment densities? So I will walk you through all of that. So in Scappoose currently, what we see, I know these numbers are a little bit small, but you can stare at it when you get a copy of the PowerPoint to have a look at it more closely. But what we see is Scappoose has about 2,240 jobs that are what's called covered employment. And so covered employment is employment that is covered by unemployment insurance. We know that's not all the jobs in Scappoose because we know that some jobs aren't covered by unemployment insurance. So you've got your sole proprietors, you've got your people working in the gig economy, other sorts of things. We'll get to covered employment in a few moments. We've used 2019 data because it is better than 2020 data. The 2020 employment data is forever going to be squirrely and weird. So I would suggest not using it, and we did have a look at it. Overall, when we look at average pay per employee in Scappoose, we're seeing about $37,700 of average pay. So the sectors with the highest average wages are listed on the right-hand side. And of those, what you can see is things like manufacturing has a relatively large number of employees. Government has a relatively large number of employees, and government includes your school district. And then some of the other sectors are just smaller numbers of employees. So this shows the same kind of information, just graphically. And what we see is that your largest sectors are things like retail trade. And you see that little red line on there. That red line is reflecting the average annual wage of employees. That's below the city's average annual wage. So you got a lot of retail employees. They're paid less than average. Government is your next largest sector. That's paid a little higher than average. Recreation, accommodations, and food services, your next wage, your next sector, that is below average, and that's actually your lowest wage industry. When you look at manufacturing, a little above average, et cetera. So we can return to this and talk about some of the implications of looking at different economic development approaches as we go through this. So then, like I said, we, well, this just looks at the change in employment in Scappoose since 2008. What we see is growth of nearly 500 employees at a 2.3% average annual growth rate. That's a compounding growth rate. We'll come back to that number in a few minutes. So historically, that's the change in employment that we've seen. And most of the sectors grew except for healthcare and social assistance. That one surprised me a little bit with its decrease. And then information, which is a fairly small sector. It's things like internet service providers and other information providers. But all of the other sectors grew by some amount. All right, and so I mentioned to you that we needed to convert from covered employment, which is only employment covered by unemployment insurance, to total employment, which is an estimate of all employment. Well, they don't do that kind of, they don't provide that kind of information at the city level. The best we can get is covered employment at the city level. Well, at the county level, we can get covered employment and total employment. And what we see is overall about 70% of Columbia County's, this is labeled wrong, by the way. It's not estimated total employment by sector in SCAPUS, so ignore that label. But what we see is about 70% of Columbia County's employment is covered by unemployment insurance. So we can use these percentages here to get us from an estimate of covered employment in SCAPUS to total employment in SCAPUS. And that's what we've done on this next slide. So what we do behind the scenes is basically say in, let's say, manufacturing, about 88% of employment in manufacturing is covered for the county. If we assume that for SCAPUS, about 88% is covered, that would take us from 266 employees to about 301 employees for an estimate of total employment. Care about this so that we can forecast total employment growth rather than just covered employment growth. This is a ridiculous level of detail to be talking about here, but I just want you to know that we're not just looking at employees who are covered by unemployment insurance. This is the best estimate that we can come to of about how many people are employed in SCAPUS. And this is people who have jobs that are located in SCAPUS regardless of where they live. Are there any questions about that? Okay, so we're starting with a base of 3,337 employees. Okay, and so we need to say, all right, if we've got 3,337 employees in 2019, between 2023 and 2043, how much employment growth are we going to be expecting? Well, we're showing three different scenarios here. We're looking at different growth rates based on different assumptions. So if we look at the forecast of population growth for the city between 2023 and 2043, and this is the forecast that is that I'm currently aware of. This isn't any change to that forecast. That's about 1.02% average annual growth. So about 1% average annual growth in employment. Well, if we assume that, then you're looking about 778 new employees over the 20-year period. You can use that in part because it's what's called a safe harbor. And a safe harbor is an assumption that if you use it correctly, which we are here, then it can't be challenged in court successfully. And remember that this is probably going to lead to a UGB expansion at some point, or it may lead to a UGB expansion. So we care about things that can and cannot be challenged in court. So another safe harbor is to assume that SCAPUS's employment will grow at the same rate as the region. That's 1.48% average annual growth rate. And that would take us to about 1,206 new employees over the 20-year period. So those are two different safe harbors that we can use. Another way we can forecast employment growth is based on information that is what's called substantial evidence. So what's substantial evidence? I would say that the growth rate in SCAPUS between 2008 and 19 is a piece of substantial evidence that we could use to base the future growth rate of employment in SCAPUS on. That's 2.32% average annual growth rate. So that gets us to about 2,126 new employees per year over the 20-year period. So certainly we can use the 2 safe harbors and not be challenged in court. I think we would be relatively safe using the historical employment growth rate for Scappoose. It is potentially open to challenge, so it's not that it has no risk, but it seems like a reasonable level of risk. And if we're looking at that, which the next few slides assume that we use that growth rate, then that will set what the forecast for land need is. Are there any comments on the growth rates? Do you have any concerns? I'm actually making a recommendation here that we use the historic growth rate. We could use other growth rates, but we'd have to have substantial evidence and a good reason to use them.
Hey, Brian.
Yeah, question. If we wanted to use a number higher than the first 2, but maybe not quite as high as the third, does it give us any benefit if it's appealed later? Or does it
give us any benefit to use a number that's less high than the top?
Yeah, so instead of like 1.48, let's say we went with 2%.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're a little below the historical rate. That give it, but still higher so we can get some land. That benefit us anyway as far as an appeal down the road when you try to expand the UGB? Or does it not really do anything for us?
I don't think it really does anything for you. I mean, the justification along with the higher growth rate is that Scappoose grew at this rate historically. So we know it's happened in the past, certainly. You've got a different economic engine in place now that is likely to be able to support that kind of growth. And so that's part of the reason I feel somewhat confident, because there's a second argument about using that higher growth rate. Jeff?
Do you know what the 20-year growth rate is previously?
No.
I'm wondering, without seeing any sort of granularity in this, if there was a year when employment started to accelerate.
So first of all, the data, a 20-year growth rate would take us back to 1999. And this data is not available until at least 2001 or 2002, because it didn't used to be geocoded at the local level. And back in 2001 and 2002, the geocoding, the locating exact places of different employment, it wasn't very good. So I try to stay away from some of that earlier data that's geocoded. Sorry. So, and then I wouldn't want to look at it necessarily 1 year to the next. I mean, it could be interesting to look at it that way, but I don't necessarily think that the difference in employment year over year is a real indicator of future employment potential. Certainly, when you have national recessions, you'll see lower levels of growth that have less to do with local conditions. So, sorry, I keep drifting off that. So we didn't collect that data, and we don't really have access to that data without a special data request, because all of this data is confidential data from the state. Are there other questions about the growth rate that we've used? I'm not trying to lock us into it at this point, but at some point we will be.
And Jay, are there any questions online?
No.
Len?
Sorry to intrude. We still have to consider the airport, okay? And I realize that it hasn't happened yet, but it's zoned for it. As you spoke earlier, we have to protect the industrial land. If we're protecting the industrial land, then we're anticipating that somebody's going to come use it.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of those processes that, you know, a year from now, 18 months from now, 5 years from now, somebody walks in and says, oh, I want 100 acres at the airport because I want to build missiles. I want to do something, okay? And because we're zoned for it, the zoning gives the pathway to do that. Okay?
Yes.
And if they meet the criteria of the zoning and if the utilities are available, they're going to come to the community. So how do you anticipate growth with this monstrous amount of potential in the process?
And so that's one of the reasons that this kind of study is revisited every so often. So when this study was done last time, the omic certainly wasn't there, and that land wasn't there for development. And so in doing this, we're making the best available guesses that we can about some of this. And the city would want to revisit it later. So for instance, back in the early 2000s, we did an EOA for the city of Lebanon. And then 2 years later, the Lowe's distribution center located there, creating a whole bunch of other opportunities. And so at that point, they relooked at their economic opportunities. And they're relooking at them now, about a decade later, and they have a whole other set of economic opportunities. And so we will be getting to about how much land do we think will be developed at the airport or in industrial uses more broadly. And that'll be at the November meeting. And I think the answer is not all of that land will be developed. So there's opportunities that can happen that aren't necessarily foreseen within this forecast. So this forecast isn't meant to be right. Any forecast is going to be wrong. Like if you happen to have in 2043 57,083 employees in Scappoose, I'd be shocked. But are we approximately right? So are we right enough so that we're talking about, say, 15 years of growth? Or does growth happen more slowly than we're projecting? So it's more like 25 years worth of growth. That kind of that kind of change is foreseen in the Oregon system, and cities are expected to relook at these issues periodically. Now, if all of the land that's in Scappoose was consumed in, say, 3 or 5 years, then that would be a problem because the city wouldn't have an opportunity to bring more land online. In other words, expand the urban growth boundary to accommodate, to have more land and to service that land. But if, say, over the 10-year period, if a lot of the land at the airport is developed, then when the city is looking at its next opportunities analysis, economic opportunities analysis, it takes that into account in its future forecasts. So essentially, the city has opportunities beyond the forecast that we're talking about here. And if growth really starts happening fast, then the city would be should look at the EOA again sooner.
I mean, in Oregon, zoning is opportunity. Okay,
I understand.
we are very restrictive zoning covenants, the process. So when you have the zoning in hand, the world's going to come to you somewhere at some time. It can't not happen. Okay.
So it is possible that Scappoose will grow considerably faster than we're talking about. And as long as that doesn't happen in the next 5 years, the city's got time to plan for it. In other words, as long as it doesn't happen so quickly that the city doesn't have time to reevaluate and plan for it, then there's mechanisms to accommodate that.
But the airport industrial process, it could grow tomorrow.
It could.
Somebody could walk in and say, we want to build 100 acres and go for it.
We could also go into a recession in this next year,
right?
And little development to happen out there for 5 years. And then it takes a while to get back into the economic climate where development could happen. So it's a matter of the city being proactive when it sees land being developed and it realizes it's got enough information to realize that we're starting to get low on land. And so I expect that's something that that Lori is looking at routinely. And we know, for instance, that there's issues with commercial land at this point. There's just not enough commercial land. So we will be talking about that a little bit later in this project. So it is entirely possible that Scappoose will grow faster than the forecast. Also possible that Scappoose will go slower than the forecast.
Thank you, Beth. We're going to move on.
Quick
Paul.
question, real quick.
We need to move on here.
I know, just real fast. Do we know the number of full-time employees at OMIC and PCC?
I
Uh,
know OMIC has 10 growing to 17.
Thank you for saying that, Christine.
PPC?
Welcome.
You know, BCC.
I think, I don't know. I could pull it out. I think 35. 30, I'm very sure about OMIC.
That's consistent with what we were told today. So we can't pull information about specific organizations out of the data that we have. It's confidential. So. All right. So if we proceed on with the 2.3% growth, we're going to look in a moment at what would happen if we change the types of industries that we're talking about. So I want to make sure that you know the sectors that we're going to talk about as industrial sectors are things like agricultural services. So it's not actually farming, but services for farming, construction and manufacturing, transportation and warehouse, and wholesale distribution. Those are all under industrial sectors. They typically locate on land that is industrial zoned. Retail trade is just all retail. Government, all employment in government. So anything that's government, whether it's in one of these other sectors or not. And then office and commercial service is everything else. So it includes things like finance and real estate, professional services, what do you call it? Accommodations and food services, arts and entertainment, that kind of thing. It's all of those other services that are typically located on commercial land. So remember that commercial land or commercial employment, a lot of it is in something other than retail. So as we look at this, in both cases, we're looking at the 2.32% average annual growth rate. So the top table is looking at what if the mix of employment stays the same. So how much employment would you have in industrial sectors? If in 2043, 22% of employment by then was industrial, that would be adding about 476 industrial jobs. In retail commercial, so retail trade, if the mix of employment stated about 23% of employment was retail, that would be 479 new jobs. Now, looking at this, how realistic do we think this existing mix of employment is? I would posit that the existing mix of employment is going to change over the next 20 years. And looking at the lower table is the mix that we're modeling for now. We've got some reasons behind this. So we'll start with retail commercial. We assumed that retail commercial would decrease as a percent of total. So that Scappoose would have more employment growth in things that aren't retail. But we're still looking at a growth of retail, about 101 new employees. It could be that retail employment will actually shrink over the next 20 years. That's an entirely possible outcome. We haven't modeled that. Government's the other one that we modeled as growing slower. So looking at an increase of about 91 employees in government. And that's assuming that government doesn't grow as fast as all other types of employment, which is reasonable since we're talking about growth of government that's faster than growth of employment, growth of population. A lot of your government employment is in your school district. And we'll be ground truthing some of the government pieces with the school district and other organizations later. And in fact, we'll be forecasting government land need entirely separately from this in a whole different process. So that leaves industrial. So we assume that industrial would increase substantially, and that's because of the OMIC and PCC and those kind of things, that you would attract more businesses in industrial. So you'd have more businesses, say at the airport or on your industrial lands, and that commercial and office services would increase by a modest amount. So those are the assumptions that we made there. And on to another set of assumptions. What we're showing here is land need on the top for the historical land mix and on the bottom for the increase of industrial growth. And so what we see, we've used assumptions about number of employees per acre that are based on rules of thumb that we see around cities in Oregon. So like 8 employees per acre for industrial, that's a reasonable estimate. Some types of industrial like warehouse and distribution are a lot less dense than that, and sometimes more dense. Retail and commercial, the densities we're talking about are typically your store with a big parking lot, essentially in a 1-story building, maybe a few 2-story buildings here or there. But generally speaking, the kind of the kind of commercial and office services that you're seeing today. So in the future employment land need on the bottom, what we're seeing is need for about 150 acres of industrial. Well, we just told you a few slides back that you had more than 400 acres of industrial land. So you've got more industrial land than we could reasonably say is going to develop based on our forecast over the next 20 years. Now, we may be wrong, and it may well be that more industrial users come to Scappoose, but you've got enough industrial land that as it gets consumed, if the city's doing some monitoring, that you'll be able to see when you're starting to get lower. On retail and commercial, we might as well just collapse those two together here. We probably don't have enough land for retail and office commercial. And this is where we need to ground truth a little bit more with the airport business park and give some thought to that. So we haven't presented slides that show that, but you probably are going to have some deficit around commercial. And I don't want to promise that, but that's my best guess once we suss some of this out. So that's the direction we're going. Is there any further input on this? Do you have any questions you want me to answer?
So on the office and commercial services, if I understand you correctly, is you're getting 26 employees per acre.
20 or 25 employees per acre.
Okay. Oh, okay. Oh,
that's okay.
Okay. So 20 or 25, we have to pick one, which then triggers the next. And you were recommending going with which one of those?
For retail commercial, 20, and for office and commercial services, 25.
Okay, so 25 per acre.
Mhm.
And those numbers are based on historical or?
No, we haven't done a specific analysis for Scappoose.
Okay.
But those numbers are based on what we typically see when you're looking at the development types that we've got in Scappoose. So if you imagine something like a corner store that it's on its own parcel, you might have a little bit lower employment there. Or if you're looking at, say, offices mixed with other commercial services, you're probably in a little bit smaller parking lot than a humongous parking lot. That's what you're looking at there. You're looking in development terms at about 0.25 FAR.
So on the next bit down below that, so this still isn't including looking at the business park overlay. So
No.
The numbers could change some at that point.
I think they probably will as we discuss that more.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Are there other questions? I want to make sure that we have some time to talk about comparative advantages.
How many more slides do you have?
This is my last slide, and I wanted Brittany to walk us through a discussion of comparative and competitive advantages, which I think we could probably end with.
Okay, Brittany.
All right.
We're gonna swap computers here.
You can just advance for me if that's okay.
That's fine.
All right. So in the next, say 15 minutes, so we can talk about some next steps, wanted to touch base with you all and really just gut check what we're seeing as your comparative or competitive advantages. This is really going to help add flavor and color to how we're describing economic conditions in the city. And this is, these are findings that we extracted from the SWOT analysis that you all did, I believe, at your May meeting. But these we see as most relevant to economic development or economic conditions. So as Beth shared, certainly local conditions are really combined with national and state conditions when we think about economic development and a future economic development strategy. But we We want to talk about your city-specific competitive advantages, and because that will have implications on the kinds of firms or companies that locate here and that choose to expand and stay here. So we'll run through these quickly, and this is open to discussion. We just talked at you quite a bit, so would love your feedback. And Beth's going to take some notes if you have anything to add or debate. So we've talked a bit about, or quite a bit about OMIC and PCC. Having that center, that economic engine, as well as training opportunities that come with it are quite an advantage for you, and they will contribute to manufacturing clusters. We are confident about that. We see Highway 30 as frankly an advantage and disadvantage. We touched on that earlier. It does cut right through what could be a downtown, but it also provides the advantages that it provides a great connection to the region and does provide that freight movement through the city. We believe that, and we heard that proximity to the greater Portland region is a competitive advantage. Sometimes it's, if you think about what if Scappoose was picked up, lifted, and then moved to a completely rural area, completely disconnected from a bigger city or a clustering of suburban communities, it would be a completely different place. And so we want to think about that proximity to those other communities as being an advantage. We heard a lot about stable and cooperative city leadership. I think this is amazing. I'd love to hear if there are examples of this, if anyone has anything to share. That's not something that we hear throughout the region very often. So that contributes to economic vitality, economic development, and business friendliness. We talked about Paul Vogel and his team, certainly the work at Greater Portland Inc. and others in terms of regional collaboration. Employment land base and industrial employment. The fact that Scappoose does have quite a bit of industrial land and that room to grow is an advantage. And we heard a bit about how there is infrastructure to support business growth, opening a business, and yeah, specifically supporting small businesses. We have one more slide here and then we can toggle back and forth.
This one and one more.
Advantages.
Nope, the next one's disadvantage.
Yeah, so one more on advantages. So you do have an active rail line, which was claimed as an advantage. I could see that being both an advantage and disadvantage. It can be certainly disruptive to a downtown, but the fact that freight is moving through in an active way. Again, heard some support for starting a small business. Would love to hear more about the SBDC presence here. High quality of life. This came up in many different ways. Oftentimes in economic development, we can talk about incentives and taxes and available property and all of those numbers and data and cents. But when it really comes down to, does the CEO want to go fishing and hiking on the weekend, then they're looking for this kind of a space. So you can have all the right characteristics in some city, but if you don't have that quality of life, you just can't compete in that economic development space. It sounds like all of you are quite proud of your high quality of life. Heard about a number of community events. There's certainly one coming up. And then proximity to outdoor recreation and city parks, in that this is a destination in the region and may continue to be so. Yeah, let's go to disadvantages and then would love to hear your reactions. So again, you'll see some of these repeated. Congestion on Highway 30 is, cuts through the town. We talked about east and west side development, the lack of commercial land and developed commercial spaces. We heard from Christine at a few different times talking about wanting to add to that economic vitality, specifically in some commercial spaces. There's problems with housing affordability. We're seeing that across the region. We're seeing it across the country. It's not unique to Scappoose, but it is something that we need to address, and certainly will be addressed in the housing needs assessment, as well as what we're trying to encourage in terms of higher paying jobs. Highway and railroad divide the town. Lack of sufficient childcare is something we're seeing across the region. Lack of sufficient tradespeople. These are individuals who would support that larger manufacturing cluster and larger manufacturing sector, and that will lead to stronger economic vitality. Need for more local services, restaurants, retail. We've been talking about that a bit, and more living wage jobs. We do believe that with the presence of OMIC, we'll see that start to expand, and we'll see results in the coming years. Lack of public transportation. Thank you for bringing that up earlier. There is some disconnection here. And lack of high-speed internet. This is, along with childcare, something that we talk about in economic development terms now as a result of the pandemic. They were not two items that we talked about prior to the pandemic, but with remote learners and parents trying to juggle work and childcare, learning that those are now conversations we're having at economic development tables.
And it may be insufficient high-speed internet. Lack may be overstating it a little bit.
So I ran through those quickly. I do want to be conscious of time, but would love your reactions. Is anything completely off base? Anything missing? And we'll spend a minute to talk about some industries.
Right.
Just one thing. I've seen this pop up at several government meetings. Lack of sufficient childcare. I just don't believe it's true. I have 6 kids. There's childcare. You might say for lack of childcare for low-income people, but there is plenty of childcare. Grace Lutheran just expanded their program. My kids are enrolled for fall. There was no waiting list. They're not expensive, but it's not for people that are on government assistance.
Is it fair to say lack of high quality and affordable childcare?
It's high quality. So I wouldn't say lack of, I'd say lack of affordable.
Affordable, that is
affordable
high
for
quality.
low income, but it's, again, compared to what else is out in the market and we looked around, it's affordable. It's just not structured for low income people.
Okay.
So you could, and I do believe there's a lack of childcare for low income people, but it's quality, it's good. And there's other places too. There's plenty of places.
Putting in the
Yes.
YMCA program.
And that I don't know if that program is going in or not, but that will also help. So, but I just don't think it rises to the bar to be put on a comparative disadvantage. It's just not, it's not sufficient.
It's more infant too, right? Like
Yeah,
baby.
So infant, there's an issue with infant. That's everywhere because of the state laws that require such strict regulation in that area.
Ratios, yeah.
But for normal children with, with average incomes for this area, I think it's very doable. Definitely not to the level of a comparative disadvantage.
Thank you, Brian.
Well, I would just add that I don't think childcare necessarily ends at like the age of 12, right? So there's kids that don't need full-time care, but still need some recreation opportunities. And I think that's where we're also lacking. So we might be sufficient in kind of that, early school-aged area, but before that and after that, I think we need to look a little more holistically around word childcare.
Paul?
I find it hard to see Route 30 as an advantage. It's over an hour to get to the 5 going north through a lot of traffic lights, and it's a one-way road. If there's an accident, you're stuck. Going south, it's about a half an hour to get to the Portland industrial area. Talk about trucks. And then you still going south have an extra half an hour of traffic. So we're kind of at an island. One way in, one way out, and I think that's why we don't have any warehouses here. It's just not possible currently with our infrastructure. I would just not put that as an advantage.
Okay, so keep it as a disadvantage.
I would say that it allows some freight movement, and without Highway 30, that the city would be in more isolated and in a really different position than it is. And it also provides some connections via, I think, Cornelius Pass Road, if I'm remembering the name of the road, over to the west side of Portland. And so I think it is perhaps a limited advantage. And congestion has to be acknowledged as a big problem for it. But I wouldn't say that it's one of the reasons that I wouldn't expect warehouse and distribution in a large way to be locating in Scappoose. You just don't have that kind of highway access. But it does allow businesses to move goods, say down to the port of Portland, or getting through the Portland region on I-5 as a whole is a big disadvantage. So it does connect Scappoose, even if it's insufficiently connected. And I think we can acknowledge that insufficiency.
Jeff?
Yeah.
Jeff Weiss, it's certainly no worse than 26.
Oh.
Where I live off Rock Creek, if you want to go downtown during rush hour, it's 45 minutes.
30's a dream.
there's a lot more people living out off 26.
84 as well. Any other advantages or disadvantages?
See the advantages.
Go to the next one when you want it.
What about starting a business or receiving support from the city or other partners for either business creation or business expansion? Does anyone have any firsthand experience with that?
Well, I've started a business and it's, I mean, city gives you free business licensing, so that's very good. But with, there's a new OMIC and partnered with Paul, the business incubator, there's a small business center in St. Helens. So I think there are a lot of resources for small businesses. So the city is helpful in that regard.
Great.
And I can say the city did just approve some urban renewal grant programs
Great.
for new development as well as for existing businesses to expand. So that's very recent.
Okay. Anybody online?
I like that the great library is on there.
We heard it from you guys.
All
All
right.
right, Brittany, go ahead.
All right, last but not least, we did want to touch on some potential target industries. So this is something that we will address in the EOA, specifically around whether or not Scappoose has the right land or the land with the right characteristics for these industries. And so we came up with this preliminary list we're looking for your reactions to based on where we've seen a concentration of firms in these industries or a concentration of talent working in these industries, or otherwise something that feels more aspirational or something that the city has expressed desire to have. So manufacturing, we've talked about quite a bit with OMIC Industries. There is a higher concentration of that those firms in Scappoose, and there is higher than average employment. Professional, scientific, and technical services, we see that as ultimately supporting OMIC and the work coming out of PCC. And although we see lower concentration of those firms here, there is larger employment, so larger, fewer companies with a larger footprint in that space. Tourism, specifically hotels, restaurants, specialty retail came out of the SWOT and some other conversations that our team has been having, recognizing that there is seems to be a larger demand for services for residents, for the folks living and working in the city. Aviation related industries, we talked a fair bit about the airport today and utilizing that as an asset, how to ultimately recruit more businesses and help those businesses expand in and around the airport. And finally, trade industries such as those for construction and manufacturing. As Beth presented, those are higher income earning jobs and also help support both local development and work, again, coming out of PCC and OMIC. Do you have anything to add?
So the question is, do we have potential target industries, not necessarily specific exactly types of businesses, but are we missing anything? Or do you think that we've got something on the list that shouldn't be there? Well, I'd like to give
Let's finish this slide first here.
So it sounds like you think we're generally looking the right direction. Christine?
I don't know if this is relevant, but aren't we a pretty large agricultural community? I'm surprised.
So agricultural services is an important thing. Agriculture generally will happen in the county areas. So you might look at that, and we could call that out under as a sub-trade industry. So.
No other questions?
All right. All right.
Want to go on with next steps, Beth?
Sure. We are going to be refining the buildable lands inventory. I'm going to go back to the question about small lots and whether we want to look at them more closely. Unless somebody says different, I'm going to suggest that we don't. But you guys might have a different opinion than that.
I'm okay with that. You used industry standard metrics, right?
We did.
Well, I'm okay with that.
I'm fine with it.
Okay. And then we're going to go and assess land sufficiency and site needs. In other words, do the math, to make the comparisons, including sussing out how we're thinking about the airport business park land as it relates to commercial and the site needs specifically of our target industries. And we'll look at the different sizes of parcels in Scappoose for doing that. And we'll be working on developing the EOA. I expect at the next meeting with us on November 1st, you've got other meetings before that, that we'll have a draft EOA, and I figure it'll have a few holes in it, but it'll certainly be a large part of the document for any review and comment and discussion. So that's all we have for you.
Wonderful. And Brittany, thank you for being here in person. I know you had a scratchy throat, but
Oh, yeah, my pleasure.
it's a lot better to have a presenter here in person, so we appreciate that. Beth, thank you for being so patient with all the questions. You did a great job answering them too. We appreciate
Good
that.
stuff. I'm glad to have the input. Thank you.
We love to hear that you love Scappoose. I don't just like Scappoose. I love Scappoose. That's what you said. That's great. So thank you very much. And if everyone wants to look at the next meetings on here, they're in bold for the SAC meetings, which are our meetings. And so I don't need to go over those. And then the Adventure Fest is coming up September 10th. It's important that everyone tries to go out and support that. And then the survey will be closing after that.
We're still looking for sponsors.
The city is saying we're still looking for sponsors on Adventure Fest as well. So I think that's everything. Is it any other business, Lori?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that city council and others have felt it's really important that we do have city presence at the Adventure Fest. So we will have a booth there. The city will have a booth regardless, but we did want to feature the 50-year plan and kind of get the word out about it still. So we're going to send out a sign up sheet. If any of you would like to sign up for like a 2-hour slot, to just be in the booth, tell people about the project that we're doing, and we'll have boards up of the vision statement, and people can just look at that, make sure we're on the right track, and go to the online survey to fill that out so that we can get just more feedback. All the feedback we can get would be great. So we will follow up with an email to this group next, or maybe tomorrow. Tomorrow should work. And we'll send you a sign-up sheet, and then we'll send you also this slide packet from tonight so that you have that.
Thank you, Lori.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone. Meeting's adjourned.
Well, it wasn't any credit to me. I was just answering all the questions.